If you've ever had that strange moment where your English feels sharp in your head, but a real conversation moves too fast to catch, I want you to picture this. It's 8:27 on a Tuesday morning, and I'm stepping into a building lobby that smells like coffee and fresh paint. My phone buzzes with a message that makes my stomach drop, not because it's dramatic, but because it's quietly urgent. The message says, "My calendar invite has been updated." That's never a neutral word. Updated means something changed, and you might be the last person to know. I glance at the screen and realize the meeting isn't at 10 anymore. It's at 9, in 33 minutes. With the one person who tends to speak in polite sentences that somehow feel like a warning. You know what I did next, I told myself, calmly, that I had time. I didn't. I sped walked. I opened emails with one hand. I tried to remember whether I'd promised anything I couldn't deliver. And my brain offered that unhelpful phrase, "I'll handle it." The world's most dangerous sentence. Because it's so easy to say and so hard to define. In the elevator, a colleague, let's call her Priya, looked at my face and did that kind, professional thing where you acknowledge panic without naming it. She asked, "You okay?" I said I was fine. And she smiled the way people smile when they know you're lying to yourself. Then she leaned in slightly and said, "Just so you know, he moved the meeting because someone else escalated the timeline. One sentence. That was it. But that sentence contained an entire story. Someone else. Escalated. Timeline. Did you catch what she implied there? She didn't say you were in trouble. She didn't say your work was bad. She implied something subtler. The situation had shifted, and the pressure was not random. Someone wanted a decision. I'll come back to that elevator sentence later, because it matters more than it seems. By the time I reached my desk, I had two choices. I could pretend I was caught off guard, or I could act like I had been expecting this all along. The second option is tempting, because confidence can buy you time, but it can also make you overpromise. And overpromising is a slow way of losing trust. So I did the boring, grown-up thing. I opened a blank document and wrote 3 lines what's done, what's not done, and what's blocked. Not the story of why, not the excuses, just the facts. It's amazing how often clarity looks like competence. At 9 o'clock, I walked into the meeting room, and I could feel the energy immediately, not hostile, but focused. The kind of focus that makes you sit up straighter without thinking. He started with a question that sounded friendly. How are we feeling about the rollout? That word, feeling, is a trap. When people ask how you're feeling, they often want your forecast, your confidence level, and your risk assessment all at once. I answered carefully. I said we were in a good place overall, and then I paused, because pauses are useful. They let you steer without sounding defensive. Then I added that there were 2 variables we needed to confirm before we could commit to a date. He nodded and said, "Okay, walk me through the variables. Again, polite, again, direct, no wasted movement." I explained the first issue, and then I said, "The second one is external." He didn't react. He just let the silence stretch a little and then asked, "External as in our vendor, or external as in the market changed?" That question tells you something. He wasn't asking for drama. He was asking for the kind of detail that changes decisions. So I chose my words. I said it was vendor-related, and I added, "We've already pushed for clarity, but I don't want to make promises on their behalf." That line, "I don't want to make promises on their behalf," is one of those professional sentences that is both respectful and firm. Try it out loud with me. Say it with me. I don't want to make promises on their behalf. One more time, a little slower. I don't want to make promises on their behalf. It sounds simple, but it does three things. It protects you, it sets a boundary, and it subtly signals that you're managing risk responsibly. He looked at me and said, "Good. Then what do you need from me?" Now, that is a rare and useful question, but it's also dangerous if you answer too quickly. Because if you ask for something vague, you'll get something vague. And if you ask for the wrong thing, you'll own the consequences. So I asked for one thing permission to adjust scope if the vendor delayed. Not a dramatic change, just a small, strategic adjustment, a controlled compromise. He said, "I can support that, but I want the trade-offs written down, and I want them today." There it was, the hidden reason the meeting moved to 9. Someone had escalated the timeline, and now the organization wanted certainty, not perfect certainty, just a plan that looked like certainty. As I left the room, I bumped into Priya again. She raised her eyebrows, and I said, quietly, "It was productive." That word is another trap. By the way, productive can mean we solved it, or it can mean we survived. She asked what he wanted. I told her he wanted trade-offs written down today. She exhaled and said, "Okay, that means he's backing you." She didn't say he trusts you. She said he's backing you. Subtle difference. Trust is a feeling. Backing is a decision. And now the real work began. I sat down and started writing the trade-offs. And as I wrote, I noticed something. The words you choose can either calm a reader or alarm them. If you say, "We will not deliver feature X," it sounds like failure. If you say, "We will deliver feature X in phase 2," it sounds like a plan. Same reality, different framing. This is where advanced English becomes less about vocabulary and more about intention. You're not just describing facts, you're managing expectations. An hour later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Because I was in that focused state where interruptions feel personal. But I picked up, and a calm voice said, "Hi, I'm calling from support about your service request." Support. Great. I had completely forgotten I'd filed a ticket the night before because my home internet had been cutting out. Small problem until you work from home, and then it becomes a daily negotiation with reality. The support agent asked me to confirm my account details. I did. Then he said, "I can see intermittent drops. Have you tried restarting the router?" The classic question, the question that makes you want to say, "Of course I did," in a tone that sounds like you're 12 years old again. But adult communication is choosing a better tone than your first instinct. So, I said, Yes. I restarted it twice. The issue keeps coming back after about 20 minutes. He paused and said, "Okay, that's helpful. Let's try something else." Helpful is a nice word. It tells you he believes you. Then he walked me through a few steps, and after a minute, he said, "I think the signal is weak at your address. We may need a technician." May need, not will need. He was softening the statement, leaving room to confirm. I asked, "What's the earliest appointment you can offer?" Offer is a good verb here. It's neutral. It doesn't sound demanding. It's firm without being rude. He said the earliest slot was Friday afternoon. Friday. That's 3 days of unstable internet. I could feel irritation rising, because sometimes the world's inconveniences line up on the same day and start to feel symbolic. But instead of arguing, I used a strategy that works in many contexts. I asked for options. I said, "Is there any chance of an earlier cancellation slot? Or a morning appointment?" Notice what that does. It implies you understand the system, and it invites the other person to collaborate. He said he could put me on a cancellation list, and he added, "If something opens up, we'll text you." I thanked him, and as I hung up, I realized this was the same skill as the meeting earlier. You can't control the timeline, but you can control how you negotiate within it. Now, here's the open loop I promised that elevator sentence from Priya. Someone else escalated the timeline. Who was it? And why did it matter? I didn't know yet. But by the end of the day, I was going to find out in a way that changed how I approached the next conversation entirely. By late afternoon, the office had that slightly unreal feeling it gets when everyone is busy, but no one is moving much, heads down, headphones on, coffee cups abandoned like little monuments to unfinished thoughts. I sent the trade-off document. Then I sat there staring at my inbox, waiting for the response that would tell me whether I'd done enough, or simply documented the problem nicely. A message popped up from my manager, short and deceptively casual. "Can you swing by for 5? 5 minutes rarely takes 5 minutes, but I stood up anyway. Her door was half open. She motioned me in, then lowered her voice the way people do when they're not sharing a secret. "But they are sharing context," she said. "So, quick heads up. The timeline escalation came from sales. Sales, of course, it's almost always sales. Not because they're villains, but because their incentives are loud. They hear deadlines as opportunities." She continued. "They promised a client a date. Not officially, but they implied it, and now we're the ones making it real. Did you catch the nuance there? Not officially, and they implied it is how professionals describe something they don't want to accuse someone of. But they also don't want to excuse. It's a careful way of saying someone created a problem without owning it." I asked, "Do we know which client?" She hesitated for just a beat, then said the name, a big one, a brand that looks impressive on a slide, which is exactly why people get reckless. I could feel 2 emotions at once. One was irritation, the other was relief. Because the escalation wasn't about my work being weak. It was about someone else making a commitment with our resources. My manager watched my face and said, "Look, I'm not asking you to absorb this silently, but I am asking you to respond strategically." Strategically, another word with a lot of weight. I nodded. Then I asked the most useful question in moments like this. I said, "What does strategic look like here?" She smiled. Like I'd made her day slightly easier, she said, "It looks like clarity. It looks like you put the choices in writing, and you make them choose. No vague promises, no heroic last-minute saves, just options and consequences." Try this out loud. Say it with me. Options and consequences. Again, a little slower. Options and consequences. That phrase is simple, but it's powerful. It keeps you out of the trap of being the person who always makes it work, even when making it work means burning out quietly. I left her office and found Priya at her desk. She was typing with the kind of speed that suggests she was trying to outpace reality. I asked if she had a minute, and she said, "If this is about the timeline, yes. If this is about feelings, I'm booked." That made me laugh, which was exactly what I needed. I told her sales had escalated it, and she didn't look surprised. She said, "Okay, so we're doing diplomacy." Diplomacy. That's a good word for this kind of situation, because you're not just solving a problem, you're navigating egos, incentives, and reputations. She asked, "Are you going to talk to them?" I said yes, but not yet. I wanted to go in with a plan, not a reaction. So I spent 10 minutes writing down what I wanted from the conversation. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want a lecture about how sales works. I wanted alignment. I wanted them to stop making implied promises. And I wanted a structure so this wouldn't repeat. Then I pinged the sales lead. "Let's call him Daniel." He replied quickly, which is always a sign he's either confident or he knows something is coming. We met in a small room with glass walls that made privacy feel like an illusion. He walked in smiling, like we were about to discuss something fun. I started gently, because starting sharply makes people defend themselves, and defensive people stop listening, I said. I heard the timeline shifted because of the client conversation. I want to make sure we're aligned on what's realistic. He nodded immediately and said, "Totally. We're aligned. We just need to move fast." That sentence is a classic. "We're aligned," followed by "we just need." It sounds cooperative, but it's also a push. So I used a sentence that keeps things calm while pulling the conversation toward specifics. I said, "When you say move fast, what date did you have in mind?" He mentioned a date that made my brain do mental math. It wasn't impossible, but it was tight in a way that would require luck, not planning. I didn't say no, not yet. Instead, I used options and consequences. I said, "We can aim for that date, but it depends on trade-offs. If we keep the full scope, the risk goes up. If we reduce scope slightly, we can hit the date with more confidence." He leaned back, and I could see him recalculating. He asked, "What kind of reduction?" Here's where the quote limit matters. Because in real life, he said several things. and I could feel him trying to negotiate the definition of slightly. But the key line was this. He said, "The client expects the full experience." I didn't argue, I just reframed. I said, "They expect results. The experience can evolve. We can give them a strong phase 1 and position phase 2 as an upgrade, not a delay." He looked at me for a second and then said, "Okay, but they need certainty." And that was the heart of it. Certainty is what people ask for when they feel pressure, even if the world doesn't offer it. So I gave him a kind of certainty I could actually deliver. I said, "I can give you a decision framework today. If the vendor confirms by tomorrow morning, we commit to the date. If they don't, we activate the reduced scope plan. Either way, you'll have a story you can tell the client without improvising." Did you catch what I did there? I didn't promise a perfect outcome. I promised a process for advanced communication. That's often the difference between trust and disappointment. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I wish you'd been on the call." That line can sound like a compliment, but it can also be a way of shifting responsibility. Like, if you'd been there, this wouldn't have happened. So I responded with a sentence that keeps the relationship intact while setting a boundary. I said, "I'm happy to join future calls when timelines are on the table. It helps us avoid misalignment." Say it with me. It helps us avoid misalignment. Again, it helps us avoid misalignment. He agreed, and we walked out with a plan that felt not perfect, but controlled. Now, you might think that's the end of that thread. It wasn't, because an hour later, I got a text from the internet company. There was a cancellation slot. Tomorrow morning. And that's when two separate timelines work, and life collided in a way that forced me into a very different kind of negotiation. The kind where you can't hide behind professionalism, because it's your actual day that gets rearranged. Tomorrow morning was the only slot they could offer, which sounded like good news until I looked at my calendar and realized I had 2 meetings back to back. Both of them the kind where my camera would be on and my brain would need to be fully awake. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was a collision of commitments, the kind that makes you choose which version of yourself disappoints someone. I stared at the appointment confirmation and felt that familiar temptation to do something heroic. Maybe the technician would come early. Maybe the internet would behave until then. Maybe I could juggle everything. The word maybe is comforting right up until it isn't. So I did what most adults do when they're trying to keep their life from becoming a small fire. I negotiated. First, I messaged my manager and kept it simple. I didn't write a long explanation, because long explanations often sound like pleading. I said I had a technician coming tomorrow morning for an unstable connection, and I asked if I could keep my camera off for the first 10 minutes of our first meeting, just in case I needed to reboot. Then I added, politely, that I would still be present and prepared. She replied fast, "That's fine. Just keep me posted." Notice what she didn't say. She didn't say, "Sure, take the morning off." She didn't say, "That's not my problem." She gave me permission within boundaries, which is exactly what a reasonable manager does. Then I messaged the colleague who ran the second meeting and asked if we could swap the order of agenda items, so I could speak earlier in case my connection dipped later. It felt slightly awkward to ask, but awkwardness is often cheaper than chaos. He wrote back, "No problem. Short, efficient, a small win." At home that evening, I tried to set myself up for success. I charged everything. I cleared my desk. I even moved closer to the router. Like proximity could solve a network issue through sheer optimism. And then, because the day hadn't tested me enough, my neighbor knocked. He was polite, almost apologetic. He said he was having some renovation work done, and there would be drilling the next morning, just for a couple of hours, he added, as if the phrase "couple of hours" has ever meant what it claims. Two things happened in my head at once. One, I wanted to laugh at the timing. Two, I wanted to cry a little, quietly, like a person who is not dramatic, just tired. But I didn't do either. I said, calmly, that I had important meetings in the morning and a technician coming. Then I asked, gently, if the drilling could start later, even by an hour. I didn't demand. I didn't accuse. I just framed it as a practical problem. He hesitated and said he'd see what he could do. That phrase is slippery. It can mean yes. It can mean no. It can mean I want you to stop talking. So I made it easier for him to say yes, I said. Even starting at 10 would help a lot. Specifics are kind. They give the other person a target. He nodded, and I thanked him as he walked away. I realized how many adult conversations are just this you asking for small mercy. Someone deciding whether your request is worth their inconvenience. Did you catch what I avoided there? I didn't say. You can't drill, I said. Could we start later? That difference keeps relationships intact. I went to sleep feeling like I'd arranged a delicate set of dominoes. All it would take was one late technician, one unexpected email, one power outage, and the whole thing would wobble. In the morning, I woke up early and made coffee I didn't fully taste. I watched the time, because when you're waiting for a technician, time becomes something you monitor, like a patient pulse. The appointment window started at 8. At 8:15, nothing. At 8:30, still nothing. At 8:45, my phone buzzed. It was a text from the company saying the technician was on the way. That phrase, on the way, can cover a lot of ground. It can mean 5 minutes. It can mean an hour. It can mean someone somewhere is thinking about leaving. I had my first meeting at 9, at 8:52. The doorbell rang. Relief hit my chest like a physical thing. He stepped in, polite, professional, and efficient. He asked where the router was, and I showed him. He ran a couple of checks and nodded as if he'd seen this exact problem 1,000 times, which he probably had. He said, "Your signal's weak. I'm going to re-terminate the line." I didn't pretend to know what that meant. I just said, "Okay." Here's the twist. While he was working, my neighbor's drilling started at 9 sharp. Not 10, not later, 9. It wasn't just noise. It was the kind of sharp, vibrating sound that makes your thoughts scatter. The technician looked up and gave me a sympathetic shrug. I could feel my irritation rising again. Not because drilling is a crime, but because the universe had layered problems on top of each other, like it was testing my vocabulary for restraint. My meeting started. I joined with my camera off, as planned, and muted myself when the noise spiked. But the meeting moved fast. People were making decisions, and I needed to contribute. I had to choose between sounding present and being polite to everyone's ears. So when it was my turn, I unmuted briefly and spoke in a measured tone. I didn't apologize for the noise like it was my personal failure. I acknowledged it once, lightly, and then focused on substance. You can get away with a lot if you sound calm. The technician finished the main fix and asked me to restart the router. I did. The internet went down completely for about 40 seconds, which felt like an hour. During those 40 seconds, my mind tried to catastrophize. I imagined my manager thinking I was unreliable. I imagined my sales lead thinking I was uncooperative. I imagined the client somehow sensing instability through the air. Then the connection came back. When the meeting ended, I took a deep breath and texted my neighbor. I didn't write an angry message, because angry messages are like throwing a glass at a wall. Even if you feel better for a second, you still have to clean up the pieces. I wrote, politely, that the drilling had started at 9 and asked if they could pause for 30 minutes while I finished a call. I used a tone that was firm but not accusing. I also made the request specific and time-bound. 30 minutes is easier to agree to than please stop. He responded with a short, unhelpful line. Sorry, workers already here. That's another slippery phrase. It shifts responsibility. It says, it's not me, it's the situation. So I replied with a sentence that keeps the pressure on the problem. Not the person, I said. I understand. Could you ask them to take a quick break around 9:30? It would really help. Try this out loud. Could you ask them to take a quick break again? Could you ask them to take a quick break? It's polite, but it's also direct. It assumes cooperation, and people often rise to the tone you set, especially when you don't corner them. A minute later, the drilling stopped, not forever, just long enough for my next call to happen without sounding like I was speaking from inside a construction site. When the technician left, he told me the connection should be stable now, but he also said something that made me pause. He mentioned the wiring in the building was old, and that if the issue returned, I might need the building management involved. That sentence opened a new loop, because building management means emails. It means waiting. It means explaining your problem to someone who doesn't feel it. And it meant I might have to advocate for myself again, in a different language register. The one people use when they're trying to sound reasonable and persistent at the same time. By midday, my internet was stable, my meetings were done, and my neighbor's drilling had returned. Softer now, like the world was finally lowering the volume. Then an email arrived from Daniel in sales. It was forwarded from the client. The client had written, politely, that they were excited about the timeline, and then, in the same paragraph, They asked for one extra feature that no one had mentioned before. Not a huge feature, just a small addition. That phrase, small addition, is how projects die slowly. I stared at the email and felt the familiar tension return. Because now I had to respond in a way that protected the team, kept sales aligned, and didn't embarrass anyone. And I had to do it without sounding like the person who always says no. I opened a blank reply and started with the safest, most strategic word in the English language. Absolutely. And right after it, I added the sentence that changes what absolutely means. I wrote, absolutely. We can explore that. Explore is the key word there. It's warm, it's open, and it doesn't quietly sign a contract. Then I kept going. Because the second sentence is where you protect your timeline without sounding defensive. I wrote, to keep the launch date solid, we'll need to confirm whether it fits within the current scope or if it becomes a Phase 2 item. One sentence, two options, no drama. Did you catch what that does? It doesn't reject the request. It frames it as a choice with consequences. That's the difference between being difficult and being professional. Before I hit send, I paused and asked myself what I was really trying to achieve. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was trying to prevent a vague sure from turning into a late-night emergency. I forwarded the draft to Daniel and wrote one line above it. Polite but clear. I'm happy to support, but I want to avoid committing to unscoped work by accident. By accident is a useful phrase. It implies good intent, even if the outcome is messy. He replied a few minutes later with, can we soften the Phase 2 language? They don't want to hear delay. I understood his concern, but I also knew something he wasn't saying out loud. If I softened it too much, he would unconsciously treat it as a yes. So I offered him a better story. I said, we can position it as an upgrade path, same timeline, plus a clear enhancement plan. Then I suggested one alternative sentence. We can include this in the next iteration to make the post-launch experience even stronger. Try that out loud. Say it with me. We can include this in the next iteration. Again, a little smoother. We can include this in the next iteration. Notice how it sounds positive, but it still places the request after the launch. Daniel responded with, perfect, send it. I sent the email, and for about 6 minutes, I felt that rare sensation of being on top of things. Then my vendor emailed back. They didn't confirm. They didn't deny. They did the worst possible third thing. They asked for a bit more time. A bit more time is a phrase that can mean 12 hours or 2 weeks. It's the kind of phrase that makes project managers develop eye twitches. I reread the vendor email twice. Then I wrote back with a message that was polite, specific, and slightly firm. I thanked them. Then I asked for a concrete deadline, and I made it easy to answer. I said, can you confirm by tomorrow at 10 a.m.? If not, please share the earliest time you can commit to. That sentence gives them 2 clean options. It prevents the vague soon. While I waited, I pinged Priya and told her what happened. She replied with a single line. Okay, so we prep the Phase 1 plan like it's real. That's an advanced skill right there. You prepare for the likely outcome without panicking about the worst one. Calm contingency. I opened the trade-off document again and wrote a cleaner version of the reduced scope option. Not as a defeat, as a deliberate Phase 1 that still delivered value. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. When you write trade-offs, you're not just listing features, you're defining what success means. And if you define success clearly, the conversation becomes easier. People argue less when the target is visible. I got up to refill my water, and on my way back to my desk, I saw my manager in the hallway. She asked, "Any news?" That question can be friendly, but it can also be a status check. I kept my answer short and structured. I said the vendor needed more time. I said we'd given them a clear deadline. And I said we were ready to execute a reduced scope plan if needed. 3 points. No extra story. She nodded and said, "Good. Keep Daniel looped in." Looped in is a phrase that sounds casual, but it carries responsibility. If sales is looped in, they can't claim ignorance later. It's quiet accountability. I went back to my desk and realized I was moving through the day in 2 languages. One language was the internal operational language scope, timeline, trade-offs. The other was the client-facing language value, confidence, roadmap. Advanced fluency is often about switching registers smoothly without losing sincerity. At the end of the day, my phone buzzed again. This time it was the building management, replying to an earlier ticket I'd sent about the internet issue, just in case. The message was polite and vague. They said they were looking into it and asked me to share more details. Share more details is another classic request. It can be genuine, or it can be a way of pushing work back to you. So I replied with an email that was firm but easy to act on. I described the issue in 2 sentences, attached the technician's notes, and asked for one specific action. Could you confirm whether the building's wiring has been inspected recently, and if not, who the right contact is for a check? That's a useful move. Instead of making them solve everything, you ask them to root the problem correctly. People are more willing to help when the request feels manageable. Now, I want to ask you something. Did you notice how many times in this story the real challenge wasn't the problem itself, but the vagueness around it? A timeline updated, a promise implied, a feature small, more time a bit, more details share. Here's the paraphrase the world often speaks in soft language. And your job is to turn soft language into clear decisions without sounding aggressive. Say it with me. Turn soft language into clear decisions. Again. Turn soft language into clear decisions. That night, I finally got home and tried to shut my brain down, but my mind kept replaying one thought. What if the vendor misses the deadline tomorrow? What if Daniel hears Phase 2 and panics? What if the client pushes back? It felt like I was carrying a fragile glass through a crowded room. I decided to do something simple that helps more than people admit. I texted a friend and asked if she wanted to grab dinner later in the week. Not because dinner solves timelines, but because your life needs to remember it's bigger than your inbox. She replied quickly and said she'd love to, then added, I should warn you, I might have to reschedule. Work is insane. Reschedule. That word has become normal in adult life. It's also where misunderstandings begin. I wrote back, no worries. We can keep it flexible. Flexible is kind, but it can also be vague. If you keep everything flexible, nothing happens. So I added, how about Thursday? And if it gets messy, we'll pick a new day on Wednesday night. That's flexibility with structure. It reduces the chance of awkward last-minute cancellations. She said yes. The next morning, I woke up and checked my email before I even stood up, which is not healthy, but it is honest. There it was. A message from the vendor, time-stamped at 9:58, 2 minutes before the deadline. The subject line was short, confirmed. I opened it, and for a second I just stared at the word like it might change. Then I read the rest. They confirmed the key deliverable, but they added one constraint, a minor limitation that wouldn't kill the launch, but it would affect the full experience Daniel had been talking about. That was the new tension. The vendor confirmed, but the confirmation came with a caveat, and caveats are where client expectations and reality start to drift apart. I took a breath and opened a message to Daniel. I didn't write a long explanation. I didn't bury the news. I wrote the clearest first sentence I could. We're confirmed. With one limitation, we should position carefully. And then I pressed send, because sometimes the fastest way to stay aligned is to name the complexity early, while everyone still has room to adapt. A few minutes later, Daniel replied with, limitation as in a deal breaker, or limitation as in something we can finesse. That question was actually a gift. It meant he wasn't panicking yet. He was asking for framing. I wrote back, not a deal breaker, more like a constraint we should set expectations around. So the first release feels intentional. Intentional is another one of those words that quietly upgrades reality. It says, we chose this. We didn't stumble into it. He called me. He didn't want to do this by email, which, honestly, was smart. Tone is harder to misread when you can hear someone breathe. He said, okay, talk me through the constraint. I explained it in plain language, and I avoided jargon, because jargon is where misunderstandings go to hide. He paused and said, so we can still hit the date? I said yes, then I added, and we can still deliver value, as long as we don't oversell the first version. Oversell, that's a delicate word. It sounds like criticism, even when it's accurate. So I softened it without weakening it, I said. I just want the client to feel pleasantly surprised, not disappointed. That line did something. It shifted the goal from impress them with everything to manage the emotional experience, which is, in real life, what retention is built on. People stay when they feel the experience matches the promise. Daniel said, got it. How do we phrase it? We drafted 2 sentences together. The first was positive and clean. We're on track for launch on the agreed date. The second was the expectation setter in phase 1. We'll deliver the core workflow, and we'll roll out the enhanced capability shortly after. As part of the planned optimization, try this out loud. Planned optimization. Again, planned optimization. It sounds like improvement, not delay. After we hung up, I realized something else. Daniel and I weren't fighting. We were co-authoring a story. That's what alignment looks like when it's working. Not perfect harmony, just shared language. Then my calendar reminded me about lunch with a friend I hadn't seen in months. I almost canceled. I was tempted to say, "This week is wild." That phrase is a social permission slip. People accept it, no questions. But I didn't cancel. I went. Because if your life becomes nothing but problem solving, you start to lose the part of you that can think creatively. And creativity is not a luxury in advanced communication. It's how you find the third option. We met at a small place that was too loud at first, and then, somehow, became comfortable. She asked how work was, and I tried to summarize without turning it into a therapy session. I said we had a tight timeline, and I was managing expectations across teams. She smiled and said, "So you're translating." I asked what she meant. She said, "You're translating between what people want to hear and what's actually true." That sentence landed because it was exactly right. Did you catch that translating isn't lying? It's choosing words that keep people calm enough to stay rational. She asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. Then I laughed, because fine is almost never accurate. I admitted I was tired, but not in a dramatic way, more like the tiredness that comes from having to be careful all day. She nodded and said, "Careful is expensive." Careful is expensive. I kept thinking about that as I walked back. Because advanced English isn't just about sounding smart. It's about being precise when precision protects relationships. That evening, Priya messaged me and asked if I could review a draft before she sent it to a different stakeholder. I opened it and immediately saw the problem. The draft was technically correct, but emotionally alarming. It used phrases like cannot and will not and blocked by, which are true words, but they hit like a closed door. I suggested small edits that changed the tone without changing the truth. Cannot became isn't currently possible. Will not became is not planned for phase 1. Blocked by became dependent on. Dependent on is a useful phrase because it doesn't assign blame. It just describes reality. Priya replied, "You are the calmest person I know." I laughed again, because calm is often a performance, but it's a useful one. The next day, the client asked for a quick call. A quick call is never quick. But I agreed. Daniel joined. I joined. My manager joined for the first 10 minutes. Because sometimes leadership presence is a signal, not a threat, a signal that the topic matters. The client started warmly. They said they were excited. They appreciated our effort, and they wanted to make sure we were fully aligned on what launch meant. Fully aligned is another phrase you learn to listen to. It can mean reassurance. It can also mean they're sensing risk. Daniel did the opening. He restated the timeline and the value, and he did it smoothly. Then the client asked the question that matters most. What should we expect on day 1? Day 1, not week 1, not month 1. Day 1. I stepped in, careful and clear. I said we would deliver the core workflow and stability on day 1. I said we would support onboarding. I said we had a clear roadmap for enhancements. Then I used one line of direct quote. Because it mattered, I said. We want day 1 to feel solid and complete. Not like a preview. One sentence, that's all. Then I returned to narration, explaining the plan in plain terms. The client responded positively, but then they did something that happens in many advanced conversations. They tested the boundary with a just one more thing. They said they had one more request, and they described it as small, and they asked if we could squeeze it in. Squeeze it in is the phrase that makes your timeline bleed. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. I did the third thing. I acknowledged the value, and then I offered a decision mechanism. I said it would be possible if we adjusted a different piece of scope. And I offered to send 2 options by end of day 1 that protected the launch date, and one that included the extra request with a small risk increase. I used the word options intentionally. Options makes people feel respected. The client said that sounded fair. Fair is a good sign. It means they're not trying to win. They're trying to get what they need. After the call, Daniel messaged me. That was smooth. Smooth is what people call it when you navigate tension without making anyone lose face. I turned back to my work, drafting the options, but then my internet blinked. Just for a second, a tiny drop, enough to make my heart rate change. Enough to remind me of the technician's comment about the building wiring. I checked the router. It was still on. I ran a quick test. The connection stabilized again. And suddenly, I had another situation to manage, not a big crisis, but a fragile system. The kind of system where one more issue could cascade. So I emailed building management again, politely, with the technician's recommendation, and I requested a timeline for inspection. I kept it brief, because brevity reads as confidence. While I waited, I stared at the options document for the client. 2 versions of reality, 2 possible stories. And I realized the real challenge wasn't writing them. It was making sure everyone chose the same one. Let's do a quick comprehension check. When the client says, "Can you squeeze it in?" what are they really asking? Not just about that feature. They're asking whether your timeline is flexible and whether you will protect it or bend it quietly. Here's the paraphrase. They're testing the strength of your boundary, and they're hoping the answer is yes. Now, say this out loud. Try this out loud. I can do that if we trade something else. Again, I can do that if we trade something else. That sentence is powerful because it doesn't shut the door. It makes the cost visible. I finished the options, sent them to Daniel, and leaned back in my chair for the first time all day. My phone buzzed again. A text from my friend about dinner on Thursday. She wrote, "Work might explode, but I'm trying." Trying is honest. It's also a warning. I replied, "If Thursday gets messy, we'll pivot. No stress." Pivot is a good word. It sounds flexible and grown up, and it avoids the slightly childish vibe of change plans. Then I looked at my inbox and saw a new email from building management. The subject line made my stomach drop a little. It said, "Rewiring inspection request." I opened it, and the first sentence was polite, but it carried resistance. They said they did not typically schedule inspections based on individual complaints, and they suggested I monitor the situation. Monitor the situation. Another vague phrase. Another soft refusal. And now I had to decide, do I accept a vague response? Or do I escalate, politely, with precision, in a way that makes it easier for them to help me without making them defensive? I started typing, and I chose my first sentence carefully, because the first sentence sets the entire temperature of the exchange. I wrote, "Thanks for getting back to me, and I appreciate you looking into it." Appreciation first, not flattery. Just a calm signal that I'm not here to fight. Then I added the sentence that turns a soft refusal into a clear request. Because I work remotely and I'm on client calls throughout the week, I need a concrete next step rather than monitoring it informally. Concrete next step. That phrase is firm without sounding dramatic. Then I anchored it in evidence, not emotion. I said the technician had noted the wiring may be aging, and I attached the note again. Even though they'd already seen it, repetition in writing isn't always bad. Sometimes it's just clarity. After that, I asked a question that was difficult to ignore, because it was specific and action-oriented. Could you advise what the formal process is for requesting an inspection, and who the responsible vendor or contact would be? I didn't demand an inspection outright. I asked for the process. Process questions are less confrontational, and they still move the situation forward. Try this out loud. Could you advise what the formal process is? Again, could you advise what the formal process is? It sounds polite, but it also quietly communicates that you're not going away. I hit send and leaned back, waiting for the familiar dance polite delay. Vague response. Another round of clarifying questions. While I waited, I kept working on the client options, but my mind kept flicking back to that phrase they'd used. Monitor the situation. Did you catch what monitor the situation usually means in real life? It often means we don't want to commit resources unless the problem becomes too big to ignore. The paraphrase is, we'll wait until it hurts enough. About 30 minutes later, my manager messaged me. Client wants the options by 4. You good? That was a small check-in, but it carried urgency. I replied with a short yes. Then I added, I'll send a clean draft to Daniel in the next hour. Clean is a useful adjective. It implies it's readable, structured, and safe to forward. I sent the options. Daniel responded with a thumbs up, which, if I'm honest, is never my favorite form of feedback. But at least it wasn't a panic call. Then, because life likes symmetry, my internet flickered again, just once, like a tiny cough. I decided I wasn't going to live in fear of a blinking router, so I opened a note and started logging the times of each drop. It felt a little obsessive, but data is power in bureaucracy, if you can say, It happened at 2:15, 3:05, and 4:10. You sound credible if you say, "It keeps happening. You sound like noise." That evening, Priya asked if I wanted to join a small networking meetup after work. Normally, I would have said no. I was tired, and my brain felt full of unfinished sentences. But I heard my friend's voice in my head, "Careful is expensive. If you spend all your energy being careful at work, you have none left for the parts of life that refill you." So I said yes. The meetup was in a small lounge with soft lighting that made everyone look slightly healthier than they were. People introduced themselves with the usual mix of confidence and uncertainty. I shook hands, made small talk, and did that social calculation we all do: who seems interesting, who seems safe, who seems like they're selling something. I ended up talking to someone who worked in operations at another company. We started with harmless topics, then drifted into the kind of conversation that only happens when both people are slightly tired of pretending everything is easy. He asked what I'd been working on lately, and I said I was managing a tight launch with multiple stakeholders. He smiled and said, "So you're basically negotiating all day." I laughed and said yes. "Pretty much." Then he said something that stuck with me. He said, "Negotiation is mostly about naming reality before it names you." Naming reality before it names you. That's a sharp line. It means if you don't describe the constraint, someone else will, and they'll describe it in a way that makes you look like the obstacle. Try it out loud. Name reality before it names you. Again, name reality before it names you. On my way home, I checked my messages and saw another text from my friend about Thursday dinner. She wrote, "I'm still in, unless something explodes." Unless something explodes is funny, but it's also a warning. So I replied with a sentence that was warm and practical. Perfect. If work gets chaotic, we'll reschedule without guilt. Just give me a quick heads up. Without guilt is important. Adults cancel plans, but the emotional mess comes from how it's handled. The next morning, building management replied. Their tone had shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. They said they could consider an inspection if I could provide a record of disruptions and if I was available to grant access. Consider another soft word, but better than monitor. It implied there was a door, slightly open. I wrote back and said I could share a short log of connection drops. I attached the times. Then I asked the question that turns consider into schedule. What are the next available windows this week for access? Windows is a good word. It feels flexible. It doesn't demand a specific day, and it invites action. They replied with two options: Wednesday morning or Friday afternoon. Wednesday morning was impossible. Because of client meetings, Friday afternoon was possible, but only if it didn't overlap with a key internal review. I chose Friday and asked for a 2-hour window. Again, specific. Then I added a simple sentence that clarified the importance without exaggeration. I'm coordinating with external clients, so predictable connectivity is essential. Essential is stronger than helpful, but it's not dramatic. By lunchtime, I had 3 threads running at once: the launch plan, the client's extra request, the building inspection. And then Daniel called again. He said the client had responded to the options. They liked the safer plan, but they wanted reassurance that the extra feature wouldn't disappear. That word, disappear, is emotional. It's not about a feature. It's about fear that their request will be forgotten. So I suggested a simple move. Put it in writing as a tracked item, with a rough timing, without locking yourself into a trap. I said we could label it as planned enhancement and include it on the post-launch roadmap. Daniel asked, "Will they accept planned?" Planned can sound vague if you don't anchor it. So I told him to pair it with a check-in date, not a delivery date, a check-in. That's softer and safer. Try this out loud. Let's set a check-in date to confirm timing. Again, let's set a check-in date to confirm timing. It creates security without making a promise you can't keep. Daniel used that phrasing, and the client agreed. They asked for a check-in 2 weeks after launch. 2 weeks is reasonable. 2 weeks is also a date that arrives faster than you think. After that call, I sat quietly for a moment, because I could feel a familiar pattern every time you resolve one tension. Another one appears. That's not bad news. That's adult life. It's just a series of negotiations, most of them small, some of them consequential. Later that afternoon, my manager pulled me into a quick hallway conversation. She said leadership wanted a 1-slide update for tomorrow. 1 slide, which sounds easy until you realize that 1 slide is where people compress complexity into a story that can be misunderstood. I said I'd do it. Then I asked, "What's the key message you want them to leave with? Because if you don't choose the message, someone else will choose it for you." She said, "Confidence, with clear boundaries." Confidence, with clear boundaries. That sounded like a podcast title, honestly. But it was also the truth. That night, I opened a blank slide and started writing the story in my head, and just as I was getting into the flow, my friend texted again. She said, "I hate to do this, but Thursday might not happen." That sentence is where friendship misunderstandings either begin or get handled with grace. I stared at my phone, and for a second, I felt disappointed in a way that was bigger than dinner. Not because she was wrong, but because I'd been looking forward to something normal. Then I typed back, slowly, with the kind of warmth that makes relationships last. I said it was okay. I asked if she was all right, and I suggested we pick a new date when her week calmed down. And as I wrote it, I realized I was using the same skill again. Options and consequences, but with kindness, a boundary, but without punishment. Because whether it's a client, a colleague, or a friend, the goal is often the same: keep the connection intact while still telling the truth the next morning. I brought the 1-slide update into the meeting like it was a fragile tray of drinks. 1 slide can't hold every detail. So whatever you choose to include becomes the story, and whatever you leave out becomes someone else's assumption. Leadership joined on video, faces in small rectangles, polite greetings, then the quiet shift into business. My manager gave a short intro and handed it to me. I shared the slide and started with the headline message we'd agreed on. We were on track. And we had a plan that protected the timeline. I kept my voice steady and avoided overselling, because confidence is believable when it's calm. I summarized the core deliverable, the confirmed vendor dependency, and the 2-week check-in the client requested for the enhancement. Then I stopped talking, because one of the most advanced skills is knowing when to let silence do some work. A leader asked a question that sounded simple but wasn't. Are we at risk? Risk is a word that can mean 10 different things depending on who asks it. Sometimes people mean schedule risk. Sometimes they mean reputational risk. Sometimes they mean, are you about to surprise me in a bad way? So I answered in layers. I said there was low risk to the launch date if we held scope steady. I said there was moderate risk if we accepted additional work without a trade. And then I added the sentence that creates a boundary without sounding stubborn. We can absorb changes, but only through explicit trade-offs. Try this out loud. We can absorb changes, but only through explicit trade-offs. Again, we can absorb changes, but only through explicit trade-offs. That sentence does a lot. It keeps you helpful, but it makes the cost visible. Another leader nodded and said, "Good. Keep it tight." Tight is their way of saying, no surprises, no sprawl. After the meeting, I felt lighter, but only for a moment. Because when leadership aligns, the next challenge is making sure everyone else behaves as if they did. Daniel messaged me right away. He said the client wanted to know whether the enhancement could be fast follow. That phrase is common in product language, and it's intentionally vague. Fast follow sounds immediate without promising a date. I replied with a simple structure. I said we could call it fast follow if we define what it means. I suggested we frame it as scheduled for the first post-launch iteration, and we attach the 2-week check-in. That way, fast follow becomes a plan, not a vibe. He wrote, "Perfect." Also, they asked if we can add a quick training session for their team. Training is never just training. Training means someone has to prepare materials, schedule time zones, answer questions, and probably do follow-up. But I didn't reject it. I asked one clarifying question that turned it into something manageable. I said, how many attendees? And what outcome do they want? Outcome is the key if they want confidence. You can do a short orientation. If they want mastery, that's a different project. He said it would be 15 people, and they wanted a walkthrough plus a recording. Okay, manageable, but only if we don't pretend it's free. I told him we could do it as a 90-minute session, and I suggested we position it as part of onboarding support, not as a custom training program. Then I added one line that protects the team. We'll keep it focused on the core workflow to make it high impact. High impact sounds positive, but it also signals limits. By noon, I got a confirmation from building management for Friday afternoon access. They wanted me to be present for the full window. That was the problem. Being present meant blocking my calendar. And Friday afternoons are where everyone tries to cram in last-minute decisions. So I did what you do when you need time without sounding like you're asking for permission to exist. I wrote my manager and said I had a scheduled building wiring check that could affect my connectivity, and I planned to be offline for a 2-hour window. Then I asked if there was anything critical she needed from me before that time. Notice the move. I didn't ask. Can I? I stated. I will. Then I invited priorities. That's professional. She replied, block it. We need stable internet more than we need you half present. That line made me exhale. It was practical. It was supportive. And it reminded me that the best managers don't just demand output. They protect the conditions that allow output. Then another tension surfaced, smaller but sharper. Priya messaged me and said one of the stakeholders had forwarded her draft to someone else with the comment, "This sounds risky." That comment is how anxiety spreads, not with facts, but with tone. I asked her to send me the forwarded chain. I read it and immediately saw the issue. The stakeholder wasn't reacting to the plan. They were reacting to the language. Words like risk, uncertain, and potentially stacked too closely. And even when they were accurate, the density made the email feel unstable. So I helped her rewrite 2 sentences, keeping the truth but reducing the alarm. We swapped uncertain for pending confirmation, and we moved the risk statement into a later line after the reassurance. That order matters. You lead with what is stable. Then you mention what is still in motion. Did you catch that? It's not hiding the risk. It's sequencing the information so the reader stays rational. Priya sent the revised version, and the stakeholder replied with, "Thanks. That reads better." Reads better is an understatement. It means I can breathe again. That evening, my friend finally called. Her voice sounded tired in that specific way that isn't sadness exactly, just overload. She apologized for possibly canceling Thursday and said she felt guilty because she'd been the one who suggested dinner first. I could have reassured her quickly and moved on, but I decided to be a little more honest, because friendship is where you practice the same communication skills without the corporate armor. I told her it was okay, and then I said, gently, that I'd been looking forward to it because my week had been intense. I didn't make it her responsibility, I just named my reality. She paused and said, "Thank you for saying that without making me feel awful." That sentence is another quiet skill. You can express disappointment without punishing someone. Try this out loud. I was looking forward to it. But I understand. Again, I was looking forward to it. But I understand. It's honest, and it keeps the connection intact. We agreed to reschedule for the following week, and before we hung up, she said something small that mattered. She said, "Let's actually pick a date now, not later," because later often becomes never. So we picked a date. It felt surprisingly grounding. The next day at work, Daniel sent me a draft email to the client. It was good, but I noticed one risky line. He wrote that the enhancement would come soon after launch. Soon after is exactly the kind of phrase that comes back to haunt you. I suggested a safer alternative. I told him to say, "We'll confirm the enhancement timeline at the 2-week post-launch check-in." It's not as emotionally satisfying as soon, but it's real. He asked, "Will that sound too cautious?" I said. "It will sound responsible. There's a difference. Cautious can imply fear. Responsible implies maturity. He accepted the edit and sent it. By Friday, my calendar was blocked for the building inspection. I had warned my team. I'd prepared for the possibility that the inspection would reveal nothing, which is the most frustrating outcome, because it doesn't solve the problem, but it still costs you time. At 1:45, I heard the doorbell. The building's maintenance contact arrived with a technician. They were polite, slightly hurried, and they had that energy of people who want to finish quickly. I greeted them and led them to the wiring area. They asked a few questions, and I gave short, factual answers. I showed them my log. I didn't tell a dramatic story. I let the evidence speak. The technician checked a panel, frowned, and said one line that changed everything. This connection is loose. Loose, simple word, big consequence. He tightened it, tested the signal, and said it looked better. He couldn't guarantee perfection, but he said it should reduce the drops. Then he added that the building wiring had been patched over time, which is a polite way of saying it's been fixed in pieces, not updated properly. As they left, building management said they'd keep an eye on it. That phrase again, but this time, it felt less like avoidance and more like an acknowledgement. I went back to my desk and opened my email. There was a message from the client, short and positive. They said they appreciated the clarity, and they felt good about the plan. That's what careful communication buys you. Not applause, just calm. And as I read it, I realized the week had taught me the same lesson in 3 different places: work, home, and friendship. Vague language creates hidden tension. Clear language creates room to breathe. Now the question was, could we keep that clarity as we got closer to launch? When everyone's nerves tend to sharpen and even small issues start to feel personal, the first test came on Monday morning. The kind of Monday where your inbox feels heavier than it should, Daniel wrote. Client wants a quick confirmation that nothing has changed. Nothing has changed is a comforting phrase, but it's also a trap because something always changes, even if it's just a tiny detail that becomes important later. I replied with a sentence that sounds steady without pretending the universe is stable. I said, "The plan is unchanged, and will flag any updates immediately." The key there is immediately. It promises communication, not perfection. 10 minutes later, another message came in, this time from an engineer. She said they had discovered a minor edge case that could cause confusion for new users. Minor edge cases have a way of becoming major support tickets if you ignore them. I read her note and felt the familiar tension. Do we fix it now and risk scope creep? Or do we document it and risk the client feeling surprised? Neither option is free. So I asked one question that makes good decisions easier. I asked, is this a usability issue we can mitigate with messaging, or a functional issue that needs a code change? Mitigate is a useful verb. It invites solutions that aren't just more work. She replied that it was mostly messaging, relief, but not complete. Messaging still takes time, and messaging still needs alignment. I looped in Priya and suggested we draft a short, what to expect note for day one. Not a scary list of limitations. A confident guide that prevents misunderstandings. Priya loved the idea, but she warned me that stakeholders might resist anything that sounds like we're admitting imperfection. She was right. People often fear transparency, even when transparency builds trust. So we framed it as onboarding support, a day one guide. People like guides. Guides feel like care. We drafted it quickly, a few paragraphs explaining the core workflow, the best first steps, and one line about the limitation we'd already agreed to position carefully. We didn't call it a limitation, we called it an initial behavior. And we explained how the enhanced capability would arrive post-launch. Then I sent it to Daniel with a short note. I said, "This will reduce confusion and cut down support questions." I chose those words because sales responds well to outcomes. Less confusion, less support friction, happier client. It's the same truth, but in their language. Daniel replied, "Love it. Client will love it. Love is an optimistic word." I hoped he was right. An hour later, my manager forwarded me an email from leadership. They wanted a final confidence statement for the launch announcement. 1 paragraph, 2 sentences maximum. 2 sentences maximum. That's the kind of constraint that forces you to be sharp. I drafted 3 versions and picked the one that sounded calm, not aggressive. The first sentence said we were on track and ready. The second sentence said we'd be present and responsive during onboarding. It wasn't flashy, but it was credible. While I waited for approval, I got a call from an unknown number again. My stomach did that small drop it does when you've had too many unexpected problems recently. It was the building management contact. He said the technician had noted the wiring was patched, and they might schedule a more thorough check next month. Next month is not urgent. Next month is bureaucracy's favorite timeline. But then he said something useful. He said, "If you experience another drop, message me with the time. We'll prioritize it." That was a shift from monitor the situation to take action when it happens. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I thanked him and hung up. And I realized that even in daily life, the way you respond teaches people how to treat your requests. If you react emotionally, they get defensive. If you respond with calm specifics, they often become more cooperative. That afternoon, the client replied to Daniel's email about the Day 1 guide. Their response was polite and enthusiastic. They said it was exactly what they needed, and they appreciated the clarity around what was included on Day 1 and what would be enhanced later. There's a phrase I want you to notice in moments like this: appreciated the clarity. They didn't say they loved the product. They said they loved the clarity. People underestimate how comforting clarity is, especially when they're spending money and staking their reputation on a launch. Now, right when things looked calm, the next tension appeared. It came from a different place. And it's one of the most common real-life conversations adults have, even outside work. A friend texted me, not the dinner friend, a different one. He wrote, "Hey, can you help me with something quick tonight?" Quick is a dangerous word. I asked what it was, and he explained he wanted feedback on a job application. He said he was applying for something important, and he needed an honest eye. I wanted to help. I also knew my evening was already packed. I had to prep for launch week, and my brain was running low on spare patience. This is where boundaries get interesting, because it's easy to set boundaries with strangers. It's harder with people you care about. I didn't ignore him. I didn't say yes immediately. I offered a realistic option. I said, I can look at it tomorrow morning for 20 minutes, or tonight for 5 minutes, just to flag the biggest issues, 20 minutes or 5 minutes. That's options and consequences again, but in friendship form. He replied, tomorrow morning is fine. That's the thing. Often, people ask for quick because they're anxious, not because they need it immediately. If you respond with structure, you calm them down. Try this out loud. I can help. But I need to time box it. Again, I can help. But I need to time box it. Time box is a modern work phrase, but it's useful in life too. It's a way of saying yes without disappearing into someone else's urgency. That evening, I stayed focused. I reviewed the launch checklist. I confirmed the training session plan, and I made sure Daniel had the approved confidence statement. Then I did one more thing that I've learned to do before important weeks. I wrote down what could go wrong and what I'd do if it did. Not in a fearful way, in a practical way. Because when something goes wrong, you think worse when you're surprised. The next day, the client asked for one more call. They wanted to walk through the training agenda. Fine. That's reasonable. But then they asked if we could customize the examples for their specific use cases. Customize is how small requests grow into big-time commitments. I handled it the same way I handled Squeeze It In. I acknowledged the value. Then I offered a controlled version. I said we could include 2 customized examples, and the rest would use the standard workflow to keep the session efficient and repeatable. Repeatable is a word that signals scalability. It's professional. It makes limits feel like design, not refusal. They agreed quickly. That was a good sign. It meant they weren't trying to extract everything. They were trying to feel supported. Comprehension check. When someone asks for customization, what are they often really asking for? They're asking to feel seen. They want to know you understand their world. The paraphrase is, they want reassurance that you're not delivering something generic. You can meet that need without building a whole new product. You just choose a few tailored moments. Then you anchor the rest in a reliable structure. Say it with me. We'll tailor a couple of examples and keep the rest consistent. Again, we'll tailor a couple of examples and keep the rest consistent. By Wednesday, launch week was officially looming. People started sending messages with slightly heightened tone, shorter sentences, more just checking, more any update. Those phrases don't mean people are impatient. They mean people are nervous. I responded with a pattern short, calm, structured updates, what's confirmed, what's next. When they'll hear from me again, I didn't flood them with information. I gave them a rhythm they could trust. And then, on Thursday morning, my internet flickered again. Just once, a tiny drop. But this time, I had the building contact, the log, the evidence, and the confidence to be direct without being dramatic. I messaged him with the time and a short note. He replied immediately and said he'd send someone to check the panel that afternoon. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. By the end of Thursday, the client was calm, the team was aligned, the plan was tight, and my life felt, for the first time in weeks, like it might actually hold together. Which is exactly when the most dangerous thought appeared in my mind. Maybe we've got this. Because the moment you think that, the world often decides to test it. Maybe we've got this. I had barely finished the thought when an email hit my inbox with the kind of subject line that makes your shoulders tense before you even open it. Urgent final QA findings. Urgent and final should not appear together, because if it's final, it shouldn't be urgent. And if it's urgent, it's probably not final. I opened it and scanned the message. The issue wasn't catastrophic, but it was the kind of thing that could become a headache on day one. A small behavior that, under a specific set of steps, could produce a confusing result, not a crash, not a security problem, just confusion. And confusion, for users, feels like broken. I read the details twice. Then I did what I always do when something might be real, but might also be exaggerated. I asked for reproduction steps. Not in a suspicious way, just in a responsible way. Can you confirm the exact steps and the environment where this occurred? Exact is your friend. Exact is how you avoid emotional spirals. The engineer replied quickly with a clear list. I tested it myself, and the result matched. The issue was real. Now we had to make a decision that would shape the story. Fix it now and risk destabilizing the build, or leave it and risk frustrating users. I pulled Priya into a short call, and I framed the problem without panic. I said the issue was real, the impact was moderate, and the fix could be low risk if implemented carefully. Then I asked, do we have a safe fix, or do we need a workaround message in the day one guide? That question matters because it separates desire from feasibility. Wanting a fix is easy. Implementing a safe fix under time pressure is where people get sloppy. Priya asked the right follow-up. If we fix it, what's the failure mode? That's advanced thinking. You're not just thinking about success. You're thinking about how it might fail. The engineer said the fix was simple, but it touched a shared component. Shared components are dangerous under deadlines. They're the sort of thing that can create new problems in places you didn't look. So we chose a compromise. We would not change the core behavior this late, but we would adjust the messaging and the training, and we would add a fast follow improvement after launch. I wrote Daniel a short update in the calmest language I could manage. We found a small usability edge case. We're handling it through onboarding guidance for day one, and we're scheduling the enhancement as a first post-launch optimization. I used scheduling intentionally because it sounds deliberate, not reactive. Daniel replied with one question. Will the client notice? That question is always the wrong question, and also the right question, wrong, because you can't predict perfectly, Right. Because it forces you to think like a user. I answered carefully. I said, most users won't. If they follow the standard path, they'll be fine. If they do the unusual thing, they might feel momentary confusion, and that's exactly what the guidance prevents. Momentary confusion is a softer phrase than problem, but it's still honest. Then I added, if you want, we can mention it as an early best practice rather than a limitation. Best practice is a gentle way of shaping behavior. It's less defensive. He said, do that. I updated the Day 1 guide with one small line. Not a warning, just a suggestion. Then I sent a revised training agenda that included a quick demonstration of the best practice. 2 minutes, no drama. At this point, it would have been nice to believe that the day's tensions were resolved, but the universe had another small twist prepared. My friend, the job application friend, sent me his resume the night before. I had promised 20 minutes that morning. I opened it during a gap in my calendar, and it was good, but it had one problem. It was vague in the places where he needed to be specific. Lots of responsible for and worked on. Not enough results. So I messaged him and asked a question that pushes people towards stronger language without insulting them. What changed because you were there? That's the best way to pull out measurable impact. He replied with a few details, and I helped him rewrite one bullet to make it sharper. I kept it short because I'd promised a time box. I told him what to fix and why. Then I stopped. That's also a boundary. You don't become someone's unpaid editor for the rest of your life because you said yes once. Try this out loud. I can give you quick feedback, but I can't rewrite the whole thing today. Again, I can give you quick feedback, but I can't rewrite the whole thing today. It's kind, and it protects you. By lunchtime, the workday had that brittle feeling it gets before a launch. Everyone is busy, but no one wants to be the person who asks the wrong question. The questions get sharper, the jokes get quieter, and people start saying things like, just to confirm, and I'm sure it's fine, but I got a message from the client. They asked if the training recording could be shared internally beyond the 15 attendees. That's a reasonable request, but it's also a potential scope creep, because if it spreads, people will ask follow-up questions, and those questions become work. So I replied with a clear, supportive boundary. I said yes, they could share it internally, and I suggested they collect questions and send them in one batch so we could respond efficiently. Efficiently is a small word with big power. It prevents a flood of one-off messages. The client replied, "Great idea." Then Daniel pinged me with a new concern. He said the client's leadership team wanted a public statement about the launch, not a press release, but a short public note they could share on their channels. That sounds flattering, but it can be risky. Public statements can lock you into language that becomes a promise. So I asked, what tone do they want? Tone matters. Tone tells you whether they want hype or reassurance or credibility. He said they wanted confident and professional, not flashy. Good. I drafted a short statement that focused on collaboration and readiness, not on feature lists. Feature lists are where you accidentally promise too much. I used phrases like core workflow, planned enhancements, and ongoing support. Nothing dramatic, nothing brittle. Then I asked my manager to review it, because anything public should have more than one set of eyes. She approved it with one small change. She replaced guarantee with aim. That change was everything. Guarantee is a legal word. Aim is a human word. Did you catch that nuance? Guarantee sounds absolute. Aim sounds committed but realistic. The paraphrase is, we're serious, but we're not reckless. In the afternoon, the building technician came back, earlier than expected, to recheck the panel. He said the connection looked stable and the earlier looseness was likely the cause of the drops. Likely is a useful word. It gives you hope without pretending you have certainty. I thanked him, and for the first time in a while, I felt my nervous system settle a little. It's amazing how much mental bandwidth unstable internet steals from you. It's like a low-level alarm you don't realize you're hearing. That evening, I finally had a quiet moment. I looked at my calendar and saw the rescheduled dinner date with my friend next week. I felt a small wave of relief, not because dinner is special, but because it represents continuity, life continuing. Then my manager messaged me, "Quick check, are you comfortable with tomorrow's training?" Comfortable is another layered word. It can mean prepared, it can mean confident, it can mean, will you stay calm if something goes off script? I replied honestly. I said I was prepared, and I had a clear structure. Then I added, if questions come up we can't answer on the spot, I'll capture them and follow up. That's a powerful move. It allows you to be confident without pretending you know everything. Try this out loud. That's a great question. Let me confirm and follow up. Again, that's a great question. Let me confirm and follow up. That sentence keeps you credible. It prevents improvisation from turning into misinformation. The next morning, training day arrived. I logged on early, tested my audio, opened the agenda, and took a slow breath. The client team joined, faces bright with that mix of curiosity and expectation. Daniel did a warm intro. Then I began, and I kept my rhythm steady. I guided them through the core workflow. I used the tailored examples we'd promised, and I kept it focused. When someone asked a question that hinted at a feature we weren't delivering on day one, I acknowledged the need, and then I anchored it to the roadmap and the check-in date. No defensiveness, just clarity. Halfway through, someone asked a question that was both simple and loaded. So what happens if we do it the other way? That's where the edge case lived. The moment we'd prepared for. I didn't make it scary. I treated it as a best practice moment. I said the system could behave unexpectedly if you took that path, and that the recommended approach would keep things smooth. Then I demonstrated the best practice in one clean step and moved on. The session ended on time. People thanked us. The chat was full of super helpful and clear, which, again, are words people use when they feel safe. Afterwards, Daniel messaged me, "Client is happy." I sat back and let myself feel it for about 10 seconds. Because launch day was still coming, And launch day has a way of taking everything you thought was solid and asking, quietly, "Are you sure?" And the night before launch, a new email arrived from someone I hadn't heard from in weeks, with a subject line that felt like a door opening at the worst possible moment. Question about contract language. I opened it, and I knew immediately this wasn't going to be quick. It was from someone in legal, and the tone was polite in the way that tells you they're concerned. They said they wanted to clarify a few phrases in the agreement before the client circulated it internally. Clarify sounds harmless, but contract language is rarely harmless. A clarification can turn into a delay, and a delay the night before launch is the kind of thing that makes people spiral. I read the highlighted section and saw the problem right away. There was a sentence that implied we would deliver the enhancement by a specific time frame. Even though we had carefully avoided committing to that, it wasn't malicious. It was the kind of optimistic phrasing people slip in when they're trying to make a deal feel safe. The risk wasn't just that we might miss the date. The risk was that someone could later say, "You promised," and promises in contracts have sharp edges. So I responded with calm urgency. I thanked them, said I agreed we should tighten the language, and asked what alternatives they were proposing. Alternatives is the word that keeps legal productive. If you ask them what's wrong, you might get a lecture. If you ask them for alternatives, you get text you can use. They replied with 2 options, both of which were safer for us, but one of which might have sounded too cautious for the client. It used a phrase like "may be delivered at our discretion," which is technically protective but emotionally unpleasant. It signals, we might do it, we might not. I didn't want to frighten the client. I wanted to protect us without damaging trust. So I drafted a 3rd option, something balanced. I wrote, "Enhancements will be prioritized post-launch and delivered according to a mutually agreed roadmap." Mutually agreed is the important part. It commits to collaboration, not a fixed date. Try this out loud. Mutually agreed roadmap. Again, mutually agreed roadmap. It sounds fair. It sounds structured. It sounds adult. Then I looped in Daniel and my manager. Because contract language is a cross-functional minefield. Daniel replied almost immediately, which told me he was also awake, also tense. He asked, "Will this spook them?" I said it shouldn't if we framed it correctly. I suggested we tell the client we were aligning the contract with the same language we'd already used in the check-in plan. Consistency reduces fear. People accept cautious language when it matches what they've heard before. My manager replied with one line that felt like a hand on my shoulder. "Protect the company, but keep it client-friendly." That's the balance. Client-friendly without being reckless. Daniel asked if he should call the client contact that night. I said no, unless necessary. Calling at night can escalate anxiety. Emails can be calmer if they're clear. So we agreed to send a tight message first thing in the morning, with the revised sentence. I went to bed, but my sleep was shallow. You know that kind of sleep where your body rests, but your brain keeps running a checklist. I woke up before my alarm and checked my phone. No new surprises. Not yet. Launch day arrived with a strangely normal sunrise. That's what makes launch days unsettling. The world looks ordinary, but your nervous system knows the stakes are higher. At 9, we had a final internal sync, quick confirmations, final checks. Daniel confirmed the client had accepted the updated contract language without fuss. Good. One less sharp edge. Then we watched the launch happen. Not like in movies, no cheering, no confetti, just dashboards updating, messages arriving, support channels staying quiet, and a steady stream of small data points that told us the system was alive. The first hour was calm. The second hour was calmer than I expected. I started to relax, which was probably a mistake, because the third hour delivered the first real tension. A message came in from the client. One user had followed the unusual path we'd warned about. And they were confused, not angry, just confused. They asked for clarification. This is where your preparation either pays off or it doesn't. If you scramble, the client feels the uncertainty. If you respond cleanly, the confusion becomes a small moment, not a story. I replied with a short explanation and pointed them to the best practice. Using friendly language, I kept it simple. Then I suggested we add one line to their internal FAQ, so future users would find the answer without needing to ask. The client thanked us. The issue dissolved. That's what good onboarding does. It turns sharp corners into gentle ones. Around noon, Daniel called and said the client's leadership team was happy, but they wanted to share a public note that afternoon. He asked if we could approve the wording quickly. Approve quickly is a phrase that can pull you into rushed commitments. I asked him to send the text. It was positive and safe, but it included one sentence I didn't love. It said we were delivering a complete solution, which is an emotionally satisfying phrase and a legally risky one. Complete invites someone to argue about what counts as complete. So I suggested a small edit. I replaced complete solution with a strong foundation, and I added with planned enhancements over time. Foundation is honest and optimistic. It signals stability and growth. Daniel agreed and sent the revised note. The client posted it, and the response was warm. No chaos, no public pressure, just normal engagement. By mid-afternoon, we had enough signal to say the launch was stable. People started to loosen up. Someone made a joke in chat. Someone else posted a celebratory GIF. And I ignored it because I was still watching numbers like they were fragile. Then my friend texted me, "The dinner, friend." She wrote, "How's launch day? Are you alive?" The fact that she remembered made me feel strangely emotional. When life is intense, being remembered feels like support. I replied, "Alive, slightly fried, but it's going well." Slightly fried is casual and honest. It doesn't ask for comfort, it just shares reality. She wrote back, "Proud of you. Also, please sleep tonight." That's the kind of line that doesn't solve anything, but it softens the edges of the day. In the evening, we had a short internal debrief. My manager asked what went well and what we'd improve. I said the clarity around scope and the day one guide were the biggest wins. Daniel agreed, And he admitted that earlier in the process, he'd feared phase 2 language would scare the client, but it actually made them trust us more. That's the quiet twist of adult life honesty. When framed well, often builds more confidence than hype. Comprehension check. Why did the client respond well to boundaries instead of pushing back? Because boundaries made the plan feel stable. The paraphrase is, they trusted us more when we sounded realistic and organized. Now try this out loud. Here's what's included on day 1. And here's what comes next. Again. Here's what's included on day 1. And here's what comes next. It's simple, but it's a trust-building rhythm. After the debrief, I shut my laptop and sat in silence for a minute. My apartment was quiet. No drilling, no buzzing, just the hum of normal life. I realized how much tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders, as if I'd been bracing for something to fall apart. But nothing fell apart. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning, the world didn't reset. There were still emails, still questions, still small problems. But the emotional temperature had changed. Post-launch problems feel different. They're not threats to the timeline anymore. They're improvements. The client sent a note thanking us again, and they asked about the 2-week check-in. They wanted to schedule it right away. I appreciated that, because scheduling is commitment. Then Daniel forwarded me a message from sales leadership. They wanted to talk about how we could replicate this process for other clients. Replicate. That word made me smile, because it meant the organization had noticed something important. This wasn't just a successful launch. It was a demonstration that calm communication and clear boundaries can actually move faster than improvisation. But before we could replicate anything, I had to do one last negotiation, a personal one. My body felt tired in a way that wasn't solved by sleep alone. It was the kind of tired that comes from being careful for too long. I looked at my calendar and saw that I had filled the week after launch with meetings, as if I'd never planned to recover. So I did something that felt like a small act of maturity. I blocked 2 hours on my calendar, labeled it as focus time, and I told my manager I'd be offline during that window to reset and catch up properly. I didn't apologize. I stated it. She replied, "Good, take it." And in that simple exchange, I could feel the final lesson of this whole story landing in my chest. Boundaries aren't just for negotiations with clients. They're for your own life, too. Because the point isn't to survive launch week, the point is to build a way of working and living that you can actually repeat. I blocked the 2 hours, and for the first few minutes of that window, I just sat there with a cup of tea. I didn't rush. I didn't open email. I didn't just quickly check anything. I let my mind unhook from the constant scanning for problems. Then my phone buzzed with a message that immediately tested the boundary I'd just set. It was from Daniel. He wrote that sales leadership wanted a call today, if possible, with a new prospect. And they wanted me to join for credibility. Credibility is a flattering word. It's also a request for emotional labor. My first impulse was to say yes. because saying yes feels like being helpful. But I just promised myself I would stop treating every request as a fire. So I responded the way I want you to learn to respond in advanced English: warm, clear, structured. I told him I could support, and I gave him 2 options. I said I could join tomorrow for 20 minutes, or I could send a short written summary today that he could use on the call. Then I added one sentence that made the boundary real. I said I was in a scheduled focus block and I would not be on camera during that time. He replied with, "They really want you live." Of course they did. Live presence feels like authority. So I used a sentence that signals cooperation without surrender. I said, "I hear you. I can join live tomorrow, but I can't jump in today without sacrificing commitments I already made. I didn't say I'm busy. I said I'd be sacrificing commitments." That phrasing makes your time sound legitimate, not optional. Try it out loud. I can't jump in today without sacrificing commitments I already made. Again, I can't jump in today without sacrificing commitments I already made. Daniel waited a minute, then replied, "Okay, tomorrow works. Can you do 11? And just like that, the boundary held, not because I was aggressive, because I was clear. Here's something subtle. Sometimes people push because they assume your no is flexible. When you respond with calm specificity, they stop testing. I used the rest of my focus window to do something I'd been avoiding. I wrote a short internal launch language playbook, not a big document, just a page of phrasing that had worked. Explore instead of commit. Check-in date instead of delivery date. Planned enhancement instead of soon. These weren't tricks. They were patterns that kept everyone aligned. Then I sent it to my manager with a note. If leadership wants to replicate this process, here's the language structure that kept scope stable. I framed it as a tool, not a critique of how things had been done before. She replied, "This is gold." Gold is the kind of praise that usually means, "Thank you. You just saved me from chaos." Later that afternoon, Priya asked if we could talk for 5 minutes. She sounded neutral, but neutral can hide tension. We sat in a small room, and she said, "I'm happy the launch went well, but I want to flag something before it becomes a bigger issue." That sentence is a professional warning label. It says, "I'm about to say something uncomfortable, and I'm trying to do it responsibly." She explained that in a leadership recap. Someone had praised the success and attributed the clarity work to cross-functional alignment. Without mentioning her directly, that sounds fine. But the truth is, people notice when their contributions become anonymous. It creates a quiet bitterness that drains teams over time. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. And disappointment, if ignored, becomes resentment. I listened without interrupting. Then I said something that acknowledged her reality without making promises I couldn't keep. I told her I agreed she should be recognized, and I asked how she wanted to handle it. Some people want a public correction, some want a private conversation. Some want to let it go, but make sure it doesn't happen again. She said she didn't want a dramatic call-out. She wanted a simple line in the next recap that named her contribution. and she wanted her manager to understand the scope of what she'd done. So I offered a practical support. I said I could reply in the recap thread with a specific thank you that highlighted her work. And I could also encourage my manager to echo it, not performative, just accurate. I wrote a message that was warm and specific. I thanked Priya for shaping the onboarding guide and helping keep stakeholder language calm. And I said it had directly reduced confusion and protected the timeline. Then I hit send. Within minutes, leadership reacted positively, and her manager replied with appreciation. It wasn't a parade, but it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement matters. Comprehension check. Why did naming her contribution help without creating conflict? Because it corrected the story quietly. The paraphrase is, you can restore credit without accusing anyone, as long as you're specific and generous. Now try this out loud. I want to make sure we recognize Priya's contribution here. Again, I want to make sure we recognize Priya's contribution here. It's a simple sentence that builds trust inside a team. The next day, I joined Daniel's call with the new prospect. The prospect asked the question everyone asks after a success story. How did you pull it off so smoothly? Daniel looked at me, and I could tell he wanted a confident, simple answer, something that felt replicable. So I gave them a story they could actually use. I said we didn't rely on heroics. We relied on clear decision points. We made scope trade-offs visible early. We documented options. And we set a communication rhythm that reduced panic. I kept it practical and avoided sounding like a motivational poster. The prospect asked if we could promise a similar timeline for them. Promise is the red flag word. I didn't jump. I smiled. And I said we could give them an initial estimate after we understood their requirements. But we wouldn't commit to a date without confirming dependencies. Then I added, it's not about being cautious. It's about being accurate. Try it out loud. We don't commit to dates without confirming dependencies. Again, we don't commit to dates without confirming dependencies. After the call, Daniel said, you make it sound so reasonable. That's the point. Boundaries land better when they sound reasonable. That evening, I finally had that calm space where work didn't feel like it was chasing me. And I decided to do something that sounds small, but it's a real-life fluency moment. I went to a cafe near my place, and as I walked in, I realized I'd forgotten my wallet. I had my phone, but the cafe's contactless payment sometimes failed. I stood there for a second, debating whether to leave. Then I remembered something about adult confidence. It's often just the willingness to ask a normal question without embarrassment. I went to the counter and said, calmly, that I might not have my wallet, and asked if they accepted mobile payment. The barista said yes. Great, I ordered, and the payment worked, a small win. But it reminded me how much of fluency is simply staying relaxed when something unexpected happens. On my way out, a person behind me accidentally bumped my shoulder and spilled a little of my drink. He looked horrified and apologized quickly. I could tell he was expecting anger. Instead, I said it was okay, and I asked if he was all right. His relief was visible, and I realized again that the tone you choose can soften an entire interaction. Now, as the week moved on, the client's questions slowed and the internal pressure eased. But the next stage of adult life arrived: maintenance, the less glamorous phase. 2 weeks after launch, we had the check-in. The client joined with a calmer energy, the kind you only get when the sky didn't fall. They thanked us, they shared a few minor requests, and then they asked about the enhancement, not aggressively, just as a normal follow-through. And this was the moment our earlier language choices paid off. Because we weren't scrambling to explain, we had a roadmap, and we had a check-in date, and we had a story that made sense. I opened the call with a sentence that felt both warm and structured. I said we'd start by reviewing what was working. Then we'd talk about the enhancement timing. Then we'd capture any open questions and confirm next steps. Simple, calm, predictable. Because predictable isn't boring in business. Predictable is safe. And safe is what keeps relationships stable, whether they're with clients, coworkers, or the people you love. We started with what was working, because starting with wins steadies the room. The client shared that onboarding had gone smoothly, support tickets were low, and their internal team felt confident. Those aren't flashy metrics, but they're the kind that keep a partnership healthy. Then we shifted to the enhancement, and I could feel the emotional temperature change just slightly. Not tension exactly, more like attention sharpening. When people ask about the next thing, they're often asking whether you still care now that the launch is done. I brought up the roadmap and gave a clear, calm update. I said we had scoped the enhancement, we had identified dependencies, and we were ready to propose 2 timing options. I didn't rush into a promise, I offered structure. The client asked a question that sounded simple. What's the earliest you can deliver it? Earliest is a trap word. It invites optimism, and optimism under pressure turns into regret. So I answered with the most responsible version of early, I said. The earliest responsible window is 3 weeks, assuming we keep the scope exactly as defined. Then I added a second sentence that made it feel collaborative instead of restrictive. I said we could also deliver a smaller slice sooner, if they preferred an incremental approach. Did you catch what that does? It avoids saying no, but it also avoids saying yes to a fantasy. The paraphrase is, I'm willing, but I'm not reckless. They liked the incremental idea, but then they introduced a new twist. They said one of their departments had become interested after launch and wanted a slightly different version of the enhancement. Not a full redesign, just a variation. Variation is another soft word that can hide a lot of work. I didn't panic, but I didn't wave it through either. I said we could explore it after we delivered the first enhancement. And I suggested we schedule a short discovery session with that department so we could assess the impact. Explore again. That word kept coming back. Because it's the perfect middle ground between dismissive and committed. Daniel jumped in and tried to reassure them quickly. Because sales instincts are to reduce friction. But I gently anchored us back to clarity. I said we wanted to make sure any variation didn't fragment the product experience. and that we would propose a clean path that stayed maintainable. Maintainable is a quiet but powerful word. It tells the client you're thinking long-term, not just trying to survive today. After the call, Daniel messaged me privately and said the client seemed happy, but he was worried they'd see discovery session as slow. I told him to frame it as acceleration. Discovery isn't delay. It's how you avoid building the wrong thing. Try this out loud. A short discovery session will help us move faster with confidence. Again, a short discovery session will help us move faster with confidence. That sentence takes the sting out of process. It makes careful sound productive. The next day, the new department joined the discovery call, and within 5 minutes, I could tell why they wanted a variation. Their workflow was different, and they were trying to fit our product into a habit they already had. That's normal. Humans don't like changing habits. They like bending tools. They described what they wanted, and I listened for the underlying need instead of the exact feature request. Then I paraphrased it back to them in simpler language. To make sure we were aligned, I said they wanted the same outcome, but they needed a slightly different path to get there. They agreed, and I could feel their trust rise just a little. People relax when they feel understood. Then came the delicate part. They asked if we could deliver their variation at the same time as the enhancement for the original department. Same time. That phrase is where calendars start to suffer. I responded with options and consequences again. I said we could aim for the same window if we limited the variation to the most essential differences. But if they wanted a deeper change, we should sequence it as the next iteration. I kept it neutral, and I kept it practical. They asked what essential differences meant, and I gave an example in plain terms. I quoted one short line to emphasize the boundary, and then I moved back into narration. I said, if we're changing the path, we keep the destination the same. One sentence. Then I explained how we define same destination in terms of metrics and user steps. Comprehension check. When a new stakeholder asks for the same thing, but slightly different, what are they often really asking for? They're asking for permission to keep their old habits. The paraphrase is, they want customization so they don't have to adapt. That doesn't make them bad. It makes them human. Your job is to give them enough tailoring to feel seen, without creating a product that's impossible to maintain. Say it with me, we can tailor the entry point, but keep the core consistent. Again, we can tailor the entry point, but keep the core consistent. After the discovery call, I wrote a short summary, the kind that prevents memory from rewriting reality later. I listed what they wanted, what we agreed was in scope, what we agreed was out of scope, and what we'd confirm next. No drama, just clarity. Daniel forwarded it to leadership, and leadership replied with a short note. Niece, this is replicable. That word again, replicable. It was becoming the theme. A week later, sales leadership asked me to do a short internal talk on how to communicate timelines. I almost laughed, because it sounded like they were asking me to teach the thing they had trouble with. But the truth is, that's progress. People don't ask for help unless they've felt the cost of not having it. I agreed, but I set a boundary immediately. I said I could do 15 minutes, and I wanted it to be interactive, not a lecture. If people don't participate, they don't internalize. The day of the talk, I kept it simple. I told one short story about the phrase soon after launch, and how we replaced it with a check-in date. Then I gave them 2 sentence frames they could reuse. I didn't call them scripts. I called them safe phrases. Safe phrases keep you from improvising your way into a promise. Afterwards, a sales manager pulled me aside and admitted something that surprised me. He said, quietly, that he'd always assumed setting boundaries would make clients distrust them. But after watching this launch, he realized the opposite. Boundaries made the team look more competent. That's an important moment. And not just for work, it's a life lesson. The clearer you are, the less people have to guess. And guessing is where anxiety lives. That evening, I met my friend for the rescheduled dinner. We actually made it this time. We sat down, ordered food, and had the kind of conversation that doesn't feel urgent, which is its own kind of medicine. She asked about launch week, and I told her it went well. She asked what the hardest part was, and I surprised myself with the answer. I said the hardest part wasn't the work. It was the constant translation, turning vague requests into clear decisions without making people feel shut down. She nodded and said, "So basically, you used diplomacy on everyone." I smiled and said, yes. Diplomacy at work. Diplomacy with my neighbor. Diplomacy with my own calendar. Then she said something that made me pause. She said, "Do you ever get tired of being the calm one?" I didn't answer quickly, because it was a real question. I admitted that yes, calm can feel like a performance. But I also said calm is a choice I make, because it gives me control. If I react emotionally, I lose options. If I stay calm, I can negotiate. Try this out loud. If I stay calm, I keep my options. Again, if I stay calm, I keep my options. On the way home, I thought about what this whole story has really been. Not a launch story, not an internet story, not even a workplace story. It's been a fluency story. Because advanced English isn't just fancy words. It's knowing how to be precise without being harsh, how to be warm without being vague, and how to set boundaries in a way that keeps relationships intact. And the next time you're in a conversation where someone says, "Can you squeeze this in?" or "We just need it soon," or "Let's keep it flexible," you'll hear the hidden meaning, you'll hear the uncertainty, and you'll know how to respond with something calm, structured, and real. The next moment I want to talk about is what happens when you try to apply these skills in a situation that has nothing to do with work, but everything to do with identity, the kind of conversation where the right words matter because the relationship matters. A few days after that dinner, I got a call from a family member, not an emergency, not dramatic, but the tone was careful, careful again. The same word, different setting. They said they'd been thinking about a decision I'd made recently, and they wanted to understand it. Understand can be genuine. It can also mean, I disagree. and I want you to explain yourself until I feel satisfied. I took a breath and chose to assume good intent. Because assuming bad intent turns family conversations into wars, I said. Sure, what part feels unclear? That question is gentle and specific. It invites them to name the real concern instead of circling it. They hesitated and then said the real thing. They said they were worried I was changing, and they didn't know how to relate to me anymore. That's not a factual complaint. That's an emotional fear. And this is where advanced fluency becomes emotional fluency. You can't fix it with logic. You have to respond in a way that makes the other person feel safe, without giving up your reality. So I said something honest and steady. I said I was changing, but not in a way that meant I loved them less. I said growth had made me set different boundaries, and that might feel unfamiliar. Then I said I still wanted connection, and I was willing to find a way that worked for both of us. That is options and consequences again, but softened by care. They asked, "So you're saying we're the problem?" That's a classic defensive interpretation. People hear boundaries and translate them into rejection. They assume your limit is a judgment. I didn't argue. I clarified. I said, "No, I'm saying I've learned what I can and can't do without burning out. And I'm trying to be honest about it. Honest about it. Those words matter. They make the boundary about capacity, not about blame. Try this out loud. This isn't about blame. It's about capacity. Again, this isn't about blame. It's about capacity." That sentence works at work, at home, and inside your own mind. The conversation softened after that, not instantly, but gradually. They admitted they feared being left behind. I told them they weren't being left, but the relationship needed to evolve. Evolve is a helpful word. It implies continuity, not rupture. By the end of the call, nothing was magically solved, but the temperature had dropped. We hadn't broken anything. We had, at least, spoken honestly without cruelty. And I realized something. The reason these skills matter is not because they make you sound smarter. They matter because they help you stay connected while you grow. Connection with integrity. A few days later, another small test arrived. This one almost comically ordinary. A coworker asked if I could take on an extra task just this once. Just this once is another phrase that can become a pattern if you let it. I asked what the task was and when it was due. Then I said yes, but only if we dropped something else, not as a threat, just as a reality. I offered two options. I could do the extra task, or I could finish the existing priority by the original deadline. They could choose which outcome mattered more. They chose the extra task, and the existing priority moved by 1 day. No resentment, no heroics, just clarity. Comprehension check. Why does offering two options often reduce conflict? Because it gives the other person agency. The paraphrase is, instead of you being the obstacle, the trade-off becomes the decision. Now say it with me, I can do that, but we'll need to trade something else. Again, I can do that, but we'll need to trade something else. If you can say that sentence smoothly, with a calm tone, you can survive many adult conversations without disappearing. As the weeks passed, the client relationship stayed stable, the enhancement shipped. The variation for the new department started as a small, controlled adjustment instead of a sprawling customization. The training recording reduced questions. The Day One guide became a template for future launches. My internet stopped flickering, and I stopped checking it like it was a fragile creature. And the biggest change was inside me. I noticed I was no longer afraid of clarity. I used to think being clear would make people dislike me. I used to think boundaries were rude. But what I learned is that vagueness creates disappointment, and disappointment damages trust far more than a respectful boundary ever will. So if you take one thing from this long practice, let it be this. The goal is not to speak perfectly. The goal is to speak clearly, with care. Here are two final shadowing lines that are simple, powerful, and real-life useful. Say it with me. I want to be clear, so we don't misunderstand each other. Again, I want to be clear, so we don't misunderstand each other. Now one more. Try this out loud. Let's decide what matters most, and build the plan around that. Again, let's decide what matters most, and build the plan around that. If you practice those, you'll notice something. Your English will sound more confident. Not because you learned fancy words, but because you're using language to create structure. Structure calms conversations. Structure reduces anxiety. Structure builds trust. And that is what fluency really is. Not speed, not perfection. The ability to move through real life with words that fit the moment. If you want to keep training, you can re-listen to this episode and shadow the short sentences. Pause after a strong line and repeat it until it feels like yours. You can also focus on the soft phrases people use, like soon, just, a bit. Keep it flexible. And practice turning them into clear decisions without sounding harsh. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope it felt like real life, because real life is where your English becomes yours. Take a breath, take a sip of water, and when you're ready, continue with the next listening practice in the playlist. And let your fluency build one calm conversation at a time.